Hello. So glad you're here. So I'm Marc Hildenbrand. I'm a developer advocate and evangelist for Red Hat. What that means is my job is kind of twofold. So I'm around, I exist to kind of, if you will, inform or educate or curate different aspects of open source projects to developers. Doesn't have to be Red Hat customers, helps if it is. But mostly I'm just trying to connect developers with the right open source projects. On the flip side, I listen to our customers and I try and feed that information that I get back from developers back into what we call our BU channels or our product streams. So it's kind of a bi-directional thing. So today I would have 3 goals. Besides getting through this talk, I have 3 goals. One is to kind of demystify, as Jeff said, what is this DevOps thing? So I'm going to co-op a little help from some mystical beasts to help me make some of these points. And these beasts are familiar. For those of you who know DevOps, you've heard these tropes before. But for some of you, you may be wondering what these beasts have to do with it. So the beasts are going to help me explain the what and why of DevOps and explain DevOps without buzzwords. And I'll try and talk about why it's trendy. I want to talk a bit about how DevOps works in the real world. What does it look like in business when you get it right, whatever this thing DevOps is? And then where might you start or continue your DevOps journey? This talk doesn't assume a ton of knowledge in the realm of DevOps, so sit back. So speaking of mystical beasts, when I was 25, I got my dream job as a video game developer. But unfortunately, this is a sad story because it's about a world without DevOps. What does it look like in a world without DevOps? When I signed up to work with Turbine, we had an amazing core engineering team, and it was the early 2000s. And Asheron's Call, for those of you guys who know this is a massively multiplayer game where you could move through a seamless world, and that seamless world was backed by multiple servers. And these multiple servers, when you communicated between servers, you couldn't talk synchronously, you had to talk asynchronously. And as a game systems developer, which is what I was, things that should be simple, like picking things up, became very difficult because, it could be across servers, and the object I'm talking to could be somewhere else. So our core engineering team said, right, we are going to help out those game developers. Watch us go. We're going to abstract away all the asynchronicity of multi-server communication. You're welcome, developers. What they didn't focus on was the tool chain. So I sit down, first day, start coding up. The inventory system is what I got. And I went to compile, and to compile my module took 3 hours. So some developers in this day and age are like, I had to wait 10 minutes for it to compile. Too bad, you don't know what it's like. 3 hours. And it has a weird effect on a developer, this world without DevOps, because you start coding in a very superstitious kind of way. You kind of batch up your compilation until the end of the day, and then you hope to God that you compiled like your small program, that your small translation unit, and then you compile your module, and then maybe at the end of the day, you compile it, oh God, it worked, you checked it in, but that's not where it ended. It gets worse. There was this thing called a nightly build, which literally took all night. And this was the build that brought in everything that went into Asheron's Call too. If you shirked and you didn't sit there and make sure your code compiled and you checked in something that broke the build, you got this. So this is actually just a dramatization of what it actually was. What you actually got was a jar of pork brains. So if you think that's gross, that comes with milk gravy. The pork brains that we got was in a glass jar, and they put it on your desk with much fanfare and ignominy, and you were the one who broke the build. So not only was it a nightmare for developers, it was a bit of a nightmare for the whole business, because if you broke that build, you couldn't evaluate what went in the previous day. You had to try and make do with a build from the day before. One thing that's at the heart of DevOps is this concept called deployment lead time. Deployment lead time is the amount of time it takes for software to go from committed code to it running in production, or for our purposes, let's just say in an environment that you can make sense of it and evaluate it. Does anyone know what this is? This may be very American-centric kind of. This is something called the Rube Goldberg. It was like big in the 1920s or something. Heath Robinson, okay, so Rube Goldberg is just derivative of Heath Robinson, as I found out here. Yeah, the reason I put it up here is, in some ways, this is analogous to what DevOps was like in my dream job, which became a nightmare. To try and get code in the nightly build felt something like that. And this is to, I think, crack an egg or something. You can look at the slides later about how that all works. What we're saying here is that to have a Rube Goldberg deployment chain was bad for developers. My dream job became a nightmare. It was bad for the company. A slow deployment lead time, a Rube Goldberg deployment lead time, meant that by the time we could evaluate features on their merits, there were already features dependent on those features that were coming through the pipe. So feature A, we can finally evaluate feature A, and we play it, and we're like, this isn't fun at all. Well, there's nothing we can do, because feature B already depends on feature A, and that represents weeks of work, so I guess we're just going to have to market the heck out of this game and get people to like this. This is the new fun. And that was part of the problem, is that fun is not something you can plan for or write up in a spec. This is something you have to experiment. You have to iterate. If only we knew about DevOps. Unfortunately, what we failed to do in Asheron's Call 2 is it was hard for us to find the fun. We couldn't find the fun quickly. Asheron's Call 2 was released, but it didn't get very high acclaim. And somehow, our studio survived to fight another day. The next title we worked on, I just shoved it in the corner there. Some of you may know, Lord of the Rings Online. And part of the reason that things changed is we finally got the political will to say, dear engineering team, core engineering, the ones that were like inter-process communication, you're welcome. It's going to be so much easier for you. We said, please, can you help us with our tool chain? Because we can't iterate fast enough. So for Lord of the Rings Online, we tried to streamline that Rube Goldberg into something that looked more like that. So what did we do? We meant our engineering team worked to make sure our code could compile in minutes, which doesn't sound revolutionary now. It was revolutionary there. It could compile in minutes instead of hours, and local developers could iterate faster. Nightly builds became builds that just happened at night. And breaking the build, you still got the pork brains, because everybody loved those pork brains, and they were well beyond their expiration date, by the way. Those pork brains were like from the 70s. But there was less shaming and what you'd call sort of a blameless postmortem to try and figure out, okay, what went wrong? Why did the build break? When we got to alpha with Lord of the Rings Online, we were able to iterate on features faster because instead of a Rube Goldberg that represented the long deployment lead time, we had this streamlined deployment lead time, which was much shorter. It meant the amount of time it took for us to figure out that feature A wasn't fun. Feature B didn't really have a chance to be built on top of feature A, so it was easy for us to say, oh, feature A is not fun, let's do it again, right? So Lord of the Rings was released to much better acclaim, I'm happy to say, and shortening our deployment lead time helped us, if you will, find the fun. So finding the fun is something that I'm going to harp on about in this talk a little bit, because finding the fun isn't just limited to video games. If you apply this to businesses in general, you could say finding the fun is just find the best customer and user experience for your product. That is finding the fun. With that comes a corollary that you'll know fun when you see it. You'll know the best user experience when you see it. The best customer experience is only found through experimentation. So if you take those two premises on, this is sort of the undergirding principle of DevOps and why it's trendy. So short deployment lead times and the other trappings that come with DevOps are what help you iterate quickly. So you have to assume that you can't know the solution a priori, and if you don't know the solution ahead of time, then you need to find a way to experiment, if you will, quickly. This kind of iteration, sometimes called business agility, for those of you playing buzzword bingo, is what can create or sustain a competitive advantage. And companies that are masters of this rapid iteration are called unicorns. So unicorns, yay, one of the big authorities in this space, somebody called Gene Kim. So any of you who are familiar with DevOps would have heard of Gene Kim. He defines a unicorn as a company that's fast-growing, internet native, and perhaps more importantly, for the purposes of this talk, these are exemplars of what he calls the key DevOps metrics. So famous, overused examples of these unicorns, Google, Amazon, Netflix, Spotify, you've probably heard it all before. From a quantitative point of view, the thing about unicorns is that they iterate faster. They experiment faster than their, if you will, more horsey cousins. So their deployment lead times can be low as a day. There are other things that come with that. They tend to, even though they're developing so quickly and releasing so quickly, they're something called they have a greater product stability. Their failure rate tends to be lower. That's just a side benefit. We won't alight on that too much. For our purposes in this talk, when we talk about a unicorn and all the goodness that comes with unicorns, let's call them truffle hogs for fun. So unicorns are really good at sussing out the best user experience through experimentation. So let's say you want to capture that spirit of the DevOps unicorn for your organization. It's a little bit like Pokemon. Perhaps you think capturing that DevOps spirit is as easy as saying, "Go, automated deployment, Azure." I don't know. I'm not really au fait with Pokemon, but my son plays it. Or maybe you think a bunch of microservices will trap him. Go, microservice, achoo. I'm afraid your attack will not be very effective against this Pokemon. That is a quote from Pokemon, for those of you who don't know. And it's because unicorns, the DevOps spirit is resistant to just a, if you will, technological attack. Why does that fail? Part of it is because technology alone is, while it's a, if you will, a necessary condition, for those of you who are into philosophy, it's not sufficient. So everything that you've heard at this talk, at this whole forum, a lot of it talks about the technology that helps enable DevOps. But technology alone is not enough. Simply building a microservice or automating a deployment doesn't mean you're doing DevOps any more than using a piping bag makes you a pastry chef. Technology is just a facet of DevOps. So this talk is to try and expose something that Gartner has exposed here. So perhaps the biggest obstacle is that DevOps is can be a cultural problem. We'll talk a little bit about this. But in my video game days, we had to learn the hard way that we had to change our culture before we could be more effective in what we did. So process, important. Technology, also important. Please don't think I'm saying those aren't important. They are totally important, but it's easy to overlook culture, which is one of the things I want to stress in this talk. So if we're going to capture a unicorn, we got to build up our culture, our DevOps culture attack. Let's see what that might look like. So if we go next. So where do we start? So when we talk about things like culture, let's revisit our good DevOps friend, Gene Kim. He wrote a book. This becomes one of the seminal works on the topic called The Phoenix Project. It's a bit of a corporate fable. So it's about a struggling company, an existing company that has a Phoenix project that's going to save the company, and the exploits of a reluctant CIO who takes on the job to try and make this Phoenix project succeed. Throughout the course of the book, there are 3 key principles that all DevOps implementations need to follow, and Mr. Kim kind of highlights those. But first, how do you catch a phoenix? Another one of these mythical beasts. One of the key points of the Phoenix project is that DevOps is not something that's only for hip young startups. It's something that can be learned by any company. It's not a fixed attribute. Capturing a phoenix, Pokemon style, is really just a matter of changing your mind, which sounds new agey, but run with me for a second. Perhaps the most important cultural shift is represented by the works of Carol Dweck, who's a psychologist. She classifies the world into 2 types of people. She talks a lot about pedagogy. One is the fixed mindset people, which are, I'm sorry if you're a fixed mindset person, I'm sorry to use red, that seems so negative. Fixed mindset, this is basically saying that in general, a fixed mindset says, whatever you know forever. And if you're good or bad, failure is just telling you you're not good enough. Growth mindset is different. Growth mindset says intelligence, when it's applied to individuals, this is something that is malleable, and that it means that something like failure or experimentation is viewed as an opportunity to grow. And something as simple as that mindset, when writ large, is sort of an undergirding cultural principle of DevOps. So growth mindset writ large is one way of thinking of DevOps. Remember how we found the fun in Lord of the Rings? Like, it was through experimentation. Nobody knew from the start what would be fun. We had to experiment over time. We had to fail over time. We had some features that were not fun, like a card game-based attack system in a massively multiplayer world. Not fun. I'll give you that corporate trade secret. It's not fun to play cards in a massively multiplayer world. That's what we found out. But without being able to iterate, we would have been locked into that kind of feature set. Go growth mindset Azure. Hey, it's super effective against a Phoenix. The point that I want to light on that is that you got to start somewhere, and you have to start by assuming you're going to make mistakes. Not just mistakes in terms of doing DevOps, whatever that means, but mistakes in trying to find the fun along the way. So let's flesh that out a little bit. If we want to capture the unicorn, we've got to get inside the head of a unicorn, or a unicorn emoji, as I have up here. This is something from the Open Practice Library. I believe they call it the Mobius Loop. And this is a visual representation of DevOps. So if you want to put DevOps in a chart, this is what we mean. Being an open source company, it's natural that Red Hat would draw upon the Open Practice Library as a framework to kind of represent this DevOps way of working. So come with me on a journey through the DevOps, the Mobius Loop. I'll quickly just highlight some of these things. First part is discovery. Discovery, this is where we understand what the problem is we're trying to solve, right? It's the grounds of our experiment. The orange part, that's sort of the executive function. That's where we decide how we're doing. I'll hold that for 1 second. The green part, that's where we do the experiment. That's where we actually do the thing that we're trying to do. The purple part is the culture. Again, the Phoenix, the DevOps kind of, hey, it's okay to fail here. You may get pork brains, but it's okay. We all get pork brains sometimes, right? Orange is what mediates moving back and forth between discovery and delivery. Because it may be that you deliver something and you learn something new, which either changes what you set out to do, or your experiment failed. You still want to do the thing you want to do, but you need to go through the delivery loop again. So Red Hat uses this loop when it comes across a project that isn't just a commodity, if you will. When it comes across a project where the fun isn't known before you start. Anytime there's experimentation, this is a useful model to follow. So Kim's first principle, so let's take the Phoenix project and kind of map it to this Mobius loop. His first principle has to do with what he calls systems thinking. So systems thinking dictates that everyone involved in a project, let's take an IT project, the designers, the IT operators, the developers, the stakeholders, the executives, everyone needs to understand what you're trying to do. Prior to being at Red Hat, I was in consulting, and it was easy for projects to get off on the wrong foot without understanding what you're trying to do in the blue part there. There are a number of different tools you can employ to figure out that blue part. Here are some. Start at the end, target outcomes. These are all things you can find at the Open Practice Library. This is the aggregated knowledge of around the world. And the point here is, again, to suss out what is it that we're trying to do. Do not forget what it is that you're trying to do. One tool I'd like to talk about is a simple tool, deceptively simple, called target outcomes. So this is having the discipline for everybody involved in the project to agree, this is how we know we've succeeded. Because if we don't know how we've succeeded, the rest of the loop will fall apart because we have no way of measuring, are we getting closer, are we getting farther away? So this is absolutely critical. This and the other principles, the other different techniques we have in the blue part, you need to start there. Otherwise, you have no way of finding your way through the Mobius loop. It may just be a circle of futility instead of a Mobius loop of productivity, virtue. His second principle from the Phoenix project, sorry to spoil the Phoenix project for those of you who are tending to read it. Principle 2, I'd summarize as amplifying feedback loops. So if we know where we're trying to go, what we need to do is quickly, this is where deployment lead time gets a look in again. We need to be able to quickly, with every delivery, iterate whether we're getting closer or farther from our stated goal. Principle 2 will map to the orange and the green parts of our Mobius loop. And there are a number of different tools we can use. So those of you, again, from my consulting background, some of you love the Agile Manifesto. I'm sure many of you have been involved in a real-life Scrum implementation, probably a 2-week cadence. You probably have a planning session. You have a sprint review. One of the tools I'd like to highlight that still is very useful in DevOps land is the notion of backlog refinement. Backlog refinement, as a consultant working with different companies, this can be terrifying to anyone who's contracting consulting work because it says, I don't know what you're going to get at the end. all I know for sure is you're going to get there the fastest way. This is the most efficient way to get to an outcome you're not quite sure what it is. Backlog refinement is at the center of that, because a Scrum, in this case, is my experiment. So I do my 2-week Scrum. When I'm done with my experiment, I get to evaluate whether card-based, massively multiplayer combat is fun or not. I decide it's not. And then I look at all the features I wanted to develop. That's in a backlog. And I reprioritize those features. Instead of saying I do feature A in week 1 and feature B in week 2 and feature blah, I say I can only plan a couple weeks in advance, and that's okay. And I use the backlog to figure out where I want to go next in the delivery loop. And I should say, it could also be that we go all the way back to the discovery loop. And I think in Scrum, sometimes you call that a spike. You may decide, oh, I need to do some other experiment, or I may need to change what it is I'm trying to do in the outcome. That's part of backlog refinement. Third principle, so comes back to the Phoenix again. If we know the risk we're trying to take, if we know we're trying to find the fun, and we don't know where it is, but we know it's out there somewhere, and we're in a position to measure it, so we know what we're trying to get, and we know how we're going to measure what we're trying to get, then we need to be able to accept the fact that things don't always turn out the way we want. So this is where Gene Kim brings in his third principle, this culture of continual learning. So remember the Gartner report that highlighted that culture can be the most challenging part? This is one of the reasons. Because it's very hard, and again, from my consulting world, it's very hard for an organization to invest in a project and watch it not get the outcome immediately. Because it's hard to tell the difference between something that's going down, failing, and about to come back up, versus something that goes down and continues to go down. It's very scary to be down on that. Let me just step to one side for a second and talk to you all about failure. So you guys hear probably all the time at lots of conferences, it's very trendy to say it's okay to fail. Failure is awesome. You're going to learn so much from failure. You need to qualify failure a little bit, because there's some failure that's not helpful. For us, when I'm talking about failure, I mean failure that comes from testing a hypothesis and having it not work. That kind of failure, that's controlled, it's bounded, I learned something from it. Types of failure that aren't good, betting the farm failure. Failure that's so big that if you fail, everybody loses their job. Not a great place to start. You might learn from it, but you won't be able to do anything about it because you'll be gone. Silent failure, the kind of failure that gets covered up because, oh my God, we can't let anyone know that we did something wrong or something didn't work. You can't learn from that failure. This is some of the way, not the only way, but this is one way that technical debt will accrue over time is, well, we'll just kind of cover that up with a script, and someday you find out things don't scale the way you want. Or the last one is sort of, there's a failing that comes from either exuberance or incompetence, which is rough to say, but sometimes you may set up a team to fail because you've asked them to do something they can't do. I love my dog. He's a great dog. If I ask him, hey, would you write a novel? Would you cook me dinner? He's going to fail. He's not going to learn from that failure. He's not going to grow from that failure. It's well beyond him. These kind of failure, that's not what I'm talking about. Experiment-based failure, that's okay. Given that, the Open Practice Library has some things to say about that. Possibly the most useful is this thing called a social contract. So a social contract is, it's a little touchy-feely, but think of it as like a constitution for your team. So you have a group of people who are getting together. Remember all the stakeholders who agree on where they're going? All those stakeholders have to agree, just put it on paper to say, hey, you break the build, you're going to get pork brains, but it's going to be okay. We're going to have a blameless postmortem. This kind of failure is okay. So it's basically a way that everybody feels comfortable that like this is a safe environment, even if your bigger organization maybe isn't as safe. Which leads us to our friend the elephant. For some of you, it's not clear where to start. Like this fictitious CIO and the Phoenix project, you're from a company that maybe grew up doing things a certain way and being very successful doing things that way. And trying to change the culture of that organization feels a little bit like this. Go Phoenix. Like, there's not a chance. There's a book on this. It's called Trying to Get an Elephant to Dance. This is the book here by Gary Groover. So we didn't come up with that. You can read all about it. In the real world, I understand there's a lot of challenges. You have ingrained culture, you have legacy systems, you have compliance, right? It can be hard to experiment when everything has to go through some bottleneck compliance or certification process. And possibly, because your company dined out and succeeded in one way of doing things, maybe Prince 2, which is great, and waterfall methodology, you may not have the skills to run to Agile or Lean or some of those trendier ways of working. So that brings us to a question: how can we capture the unicorn if we first need to tame the elephant? Well, Red Hat has some advice for you. So I'll quickly run through some of these. I highly encourage you, if you haven't already, to visit the Innovation Labs booth. It's kind of in the back of the kind of expo-y part of our forum. There's a lot of very skilled people there, and some who have worked on some of the projects that I'll quickly mention. So as I go down this list, your investment increases, but your potential win also increases as you go down. So the easiest thing you can do, you can go to the Open Practice Library. It is open. Hooray for openness. This is Red Hat. You can go there. All the stuff is there. You don't need to go to Red Hat. You can read about it yourself, and you can find out whether what I told you is true. You can get a Red Hat Learning subscription. Perhaps some of you didn't know that Red Hat does a huge amount of training. There's 60 different courses, 400 hours of video, high-definition video, I need to highlight to you, which is great. You can watch it in HD, 4K. We have one of the courses that we highlight, I want to highlight to you, this DevOps Culture and Practice course. So this is like riding the Mobius Loop. If it were a carnival ride, it would be riding the Mobius Loop, because what we do is we simulate a problem that needs to be solved via DevOps. It's a 5-day immersive project where you get to employ some of the tools I talked about in the Open Practice Library. And the last one is something that's called residency. This is a bigger ask, but the outcomes are much bigger. You heard a little bit of it with our Innovation Award winner, Heritage Bank. I won't go into that case study, but definitely we'll go to the booth. One thing I will say about that study is Heritage Bank started digital transformation focusing on technology, and through some innocent questions of the team that was saying, oh, what are you doing with your process and culture to try and affect digital transformation, led them down this road that has them becoming an exemplar of DevOps now and winning an innovation award for the project that they had. So this is the booth. We could talk about it for hours. We don't have hours, as this time is telling me. So let's just review some of what I was trying to do today. For the what and why of DevOps, I want you to think, remember the unicorns, or the unicorn emoji. The unicorns find the fun faster. Oh, stupid unicorns, I want to find the fun as fast as you do. DevOps is about finding the fun as fast as the unicorns are, finding the best user experience through experimentation and iteration. In terms of DevOps in the real world, I want you to think a little bit about the elephant. So you can tame that elephant with the Mobius Loop. Red Hat's Open Innovation Labs can help you through that, but that's an open thing. Visit the Open Practice Library. It's about experimentation and shrinking that deployment lead time. And how to start? Remember the phoenix. Do not underestimate the cultural change. Remember the Gartner report, and there's a link to that. It's important to have, if you will, a growth mindset, if that's not too pop culturally for you. But you need to understand that if you're going to find the fun, you're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's okay. So explore today, Open Practice Library. Definitely, we do discovery sessions, but if you are interested in any of the 4 things I talked about, from residency upwards, please visit us in the Expo Center. I don't know if that's too much calling it that. And thank you very much.